The late August sun beat down on the black asphalt of the Fairlane Prestige parking lot, baking the air thick and heavy. Danielle Rivers, her reflection shimmering in the tinted glass of her nondescript sedan, adjusted the collar of her worn denim jacket. It felt strange, almost alien, against her skin. This morning, she wasn't the regional VP of Fairlane Automotive Group, the woman who commanded boardrooms with tailored suits and a steely gaze. Today, she was just a woman trying to buy a car. A simple, almost absurd premise, yet the weight of it settled in her stomach, a knot of anticipation and unease. The Augusta dealership, a gleaming chrome and glass monument to consumerism, loomed before her. Its pristine facade clashed with the gnawing reports that had landed on her desk. Plummeting sales, customer complaints escalating into online firestorms. The numbers told a story of decline, but the whispers painted a darker picture, one of prejudice, apathy, and a rot spreading from within. This wasn't simply about lost revenue. It was about a betrayal of the Fairlane name, a name her own grandfather had helped build. She took a deep breath, the cloying sweetness of overripe honeysuckle from a nearby bush doing little to dispel the tension. Her disguise, carefully cultivated the faded jeans, the simple blouse, the absence of her usual power heels was meant to strip her of the authority that came with her title, to allow her to see the dealership as any other customer would. A small, cynical voice in the back of her mind wondered if it would even matter. Could a change of clothes truly penetrate the layers of ingrained behavior? She pushed the thought away, reminding herself of the purpose of this charade. She wasn't here to judge. She was here to observe, to understand, to find the source of the infection. The automatic doors slid open with a hushed sigh, revealing a cool, air-conditioned sanctuary. The scent of new leather and industrial cleaner hung in the air, a sterile contrast to the humid heat outside. A young woman sat behind the reception desk, her gaze fixed on the screen of her phone, a strand of bubblegum pink hair falling across her face. Danielle approached, a faint chime announcing her arrival. The receptionist glanced up, her expression a mixture of boredom and mild annoyance. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of any welcome. Danielle noted the lack of eye contact, the almost practiced disinterest. "I'm looking to buy a car," Danielle replied, forcing a tentative smile. "Just browsing for now." The receptionist gestured vaguely towards the showroom floor. "They're all over there," she mumbled, her attention already drifting back to her phone. No offer of assistance, no introduction to a salesperson, no genuine engagement. The first impression, Danielle thought grimly, was far from promising. The showroom floor gleamed under the strategically placed spotlights, each vehicle polished to a blinding sheen. Two salesmen stood near the entrance, engaged in a hushed conversation. One, a tall man with slicked back hair and a name tag that read Maddox, glanced at Danielle with a cursory, dismissive sweep of his eyes before returning to his conversation. The other, a younger man with a nervous energy, fidgeted with his tie. Danielle hesitated, a flicker of self-doubt momentarily clouding her resolve. This was it, the moment of truth. She forced herself to move forward, her footsteps echoing slightly on the polished tiles. As she neared the two men, she overheard snippets of their conversation. "Waste of time, not serious dress like that." Maddox's voice, laced with derision, sent a chill down Danielle's spine. Were they talking about her? The younger salesman, whose name tag identified him as M. Caldwell, shifted uncomfortably. "We should still," he started, but Maddox cut him off. "Come on, Mark. You think she's got the cash for a prestige model? Look at her." The raw contempt in Maddox's voice ignited a spark of anger within Danielle. She knew, logically, that this was precisely the kind of behavior she was here to uncover, but the personal sting of it was unexpected. She took a deep breath, schooling her features into a neutral expression. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm despite the turmoil brewing inside. Maddox turned, his expression shifting from dismissive boredom to a practiced, almost oily charm. The transformation was so abrupt, so calculated, that it felt almost theatrical. Yes, ma'am, he asked, his voice dripping with false sincerity. Danielle met his gaze, a flicker of steel in her eyes. I'm interested in looking at the new Fairlane X7, she said, choosing the top-of-the-line model deliberately. Maddox's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a subtle twitch betraying his surprise. He recovered quickly, though. Of course, he said smoothly. Excellent choice. He trailed off, glancing at T-Max, another salesman who had joined them, seemingly out of nowhere. A silent exchange passed between them, a look that spoke volumes. T-Max gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Danielle watched the interplay, her mind racing. What were they communicating? Was it a signal? A code? Maddox cleared his throat, turning back to her. Actually, ma'am, he said, a hint of reluctance in his voice. My colleague here, T-Max, is just finishing up with another customer. He'll be free to assist you in just a moment. Why don't you have a seat? He gestured toward a row of uncomfortable-looking plastic chairs. Danielle felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp. She knew, with absolute certainty, that they were dismissing her, judging her based on her appearance. She wanted to confront them, to reveal her true identity and tear into them for their blatant prejudice. But she held back. She needed to see this through, to gather enough evidence to justify the drastic changes she knew were necessary. I prefer to speak with someone now, she said, her voice firm. Maddox's smile tightened, becoming strained. He opened his mouth to reply, but before he could utter a word, a voice spoke up from behind them. I can help you, ma'am. It was Mark Caldwell, the younger salesman. He stepped forward, his gaze meeting Danielle's with a genuine warmth that startled her. I'm Mark, he said, extending his hand. What can I do for you? The cool air of the Fairlane Prestige showroom, a stark contrast to the humid Georgia morning outside, carried the faint scent of new leather and polished chrome. Danielle Rivers, disguised in a simple blouse and jeans, a far cry from her usual tailored suits, stood near the entrance, observing. Sunlight streamed through the vast windows, illuminating rows of gleaming luxury vehicles. It should have been a scene of aspiration, of dreams realized, but a subtle unease prickled at her. This wasn't just another dealership visit. It was a reconnaissance mission, a silent infiltration into the heart of a problem that had been plaguing her region. The Augusta branch, consistently underperforming, had been flagged for its poor customer service, and the whispers hinted at something deeper, something she needed to see firsthand. Her gaze drifted to a cluster of salesmen huddled near the coffee machine, their laughter echoing across the polished floor. It was a casual, almost boisterous camaraderie, the kind that should have instilled confidence in potential buyers. But something about their relaxed posture, the almost predatory gleam in their eyes, rubbed Danielle the wrong way. She'd spent years in this business, climbed the ranks through hard work and an unwavering focus on customer satisfaction. This felt different. She watched as a middle-aged woman, her face etched with a mix of nervousness and excitement, tentatively approached a gleaming silver sedan. Her hand reached out, almost hesitant to touch the polished surface. This, Danielle thought, was the moment. The moment where dreams could be realized, where aspiration could transform into ownership. The woman's hopeful expression faltered as she tried to catch the attention of one of the salesmen. They glanced at her, then at each other, a silent communication passing between them. No one moved. The woman's hand retreated, her shoulders slumping slightly. Danielle's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. This was it, the subtle dismissal, the unspoken judgment that the reports had hinted at. Drifting closer, she caught snippets of their conversation. Cash buyer? Doubt it. With that handbag, a ripple of laughter followed. Probably just window shopping, Danielle's internal monologue raged. A handbag? They were judging her based on a handbag? The sheer audacity of it stoked a fire in her gut. This wasn't about sales targets. This was about basic human decency. The woman, clearly feeling the weight of their indifference, finally turned and walked towards the exit, her shoulders bowed. They laughed hard at that. No one approached her. The words echoed in Danielle's mind, not as a simple observation, but as a condemnation. It was a microcosm of a larger problem, the insidious erosion of customer service, the blatant disregard for the very people who kept their business afloat. She felt a surge of anger, a cold, controlled fury that was far more dangerous than any outburst. Years of corporate training, of navigating the complex world of automotive sales, had taught her to channel her emotions, to use them as fuel rather than allowing them to consume her. This wasn't just about one lost sale. It was about a systemic failure, a rot that had taken hold and was threatening to poison the entire branch. Her initial plan had been to observe, to gather evidence, to build a case. But watching that woman walk away, her dreams effectively crushed by their callous indifference, shifted something within her. She couldn't wait. She wouldn't wait. Taking a deep breath, Danielle straightened her shoulders and walked purposefully towards the group of salesmen. Each step was deliberate, measured, the click of her heels on the polished floor a subtle announcement of her presence. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a mixture of anger and a strange sense of anticipation. As she neared, two of the salesmen, Maddox and T-Max, finally noticed her. Their laughter faded, replaced by a look of mild annoyance. They were clearly irritated by this interruption to their casual gathering. Maddox, the taller of the two, with a slick-back hairstyle and a condescending smirk, was the first to speak. "Can I help you, ma'am?" The words were polite, but the tone dripped with condescension, the unspoken question hanging in the air. "Can you afford to be here?" Danielle paused, her eyes sweeping over them, taking in their expensive suits, their perfectly coiffed hair, the air of entitlement that clung to them like a second skin. She allowed a flicker of uncertainty to cross her face, a carefully crafted mask of vulnerability. "I was interested in looking at the new Fairlane Elite," she stammered, her voice softer than usual. Inside, a cold, calculating voice whispered, "Let the games begin." The Augusta morning hung heavy and humid, the air thick enough to taste. Danielle Rivers, disguised in a simple cotton dress and sensible flats, adjusted her sunglasses, the slight pressure on the bridge of her nose a grounding reminder of her purpose. The Fairlane Prestige showroom gleamed, a cathedral of chrome and glass, the new car smell a potent mix of leather, plastic, and ambition. It was a far cry from the polished steel and hushed reverence of the Atlanta headquarters she oversaw as regional VP. This dealership, however, was a festering wound on Fairlane's otherwise healthy body, its sales figures bleeding red ink for the past 2 quarters. The complaints, veiled and overt, spoke of a rot deeper than simple mismanagement. Today, Danielle, under the guise of a potential customer, aimed to lance that boil. Her entrance was met with the studied indifference of the receptionist, a young woman more absorbed in the rhythmic tapping of her acrylic nails on the glass-top desk than acknowledging the potential client standing before her. Danielle felt a flicker of annoyance, a spark of the controlled fury she'd banked since arriving in Augusta. "Patience, Danielle. Play the part." She cleared her throat, a small, polite sound that nonetheless seemed to grate on the receptionist's carefully constructed apathy. "I'm looking to buy a car," Danielle said, her voice soft but firm, the kind of voice that expected to be heard. Finally, the receptionist looked up, her gaze flitting over Danielle's unassuming attire with a barely veiled dismissal. Already judging me, Danielle thought, the observation both irritating and validating. "Someone will be with you shortly," the receptionist mumbled, returning to her digital distraction. Danielle stood there, a silent observer in the carefully orchestrated ballet of disregard. Several minutes ticked by, each one a deliberate prick to Danielle's patience. She could feel the subtle shift in her demeanor, the professional calm slowly giving way to the simmering anger she'd learned to control, to weaponize. This is precisely what they've been reporting. The thought solidified her resolve. Finally, a man approached, his name tag glinting under the showroom lights. Maddox. He exuded an air of practiced charm, the kind that felt slick and insincere. His smile, too wide, too quick, didn't reach his eyes, which scanned Danielle with an assessing, almost predatory gleam. "Good morning, ma'am," he began, his voice oozing with a synthetic warmth. Looking to upgrade your ride? I'm looking to buy a car, Danielle repeated, her tone even neutral. Her mind, however, was a whirlwind of observations. Maddox's posture, the subtle way he held his hands, the slight flare of his nostrils all spoke of a man accustomed to sizing people up, categorizing them, and deciding their worth. Of course, Maddox replied, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second, a crack in his carefully constructed facade. He gestured vaguely towards the rear of the showroom. Might be best to start you off with something in the pre-owned lot. Get a feel for things. The statement hung in the air, heavy with unspoken assumptions. Danielle's gaze remained steady, her expression carefully blank. He's already decided I can't afford a new car. The realization was a cold knot in her stomach. She could almost feel the condescending pat on the head, the subtle dismissal that relegated her to the second-class citizen category. The anger, banked for so long, began to lick at the edges of her composure. I saw a few new ones I liked out here, Danielle said, her voice still soft but with a newly acquired steel. She let her gaze sweep across the gleaming rows of new vehicles, her eyes lingering on a sleek, obsidian-black Fairlane executive sedan. Maddox followed her gaze, his expression shifting from polite disinterest to thinly veiled impatience. Those are premium models, he said. The word premium dripping with an implication Danielle found both infuriating and revealing. Perhaps after we've explored the pre-owned options, he didn't finish the sentence, but the message was clear. You don't belong here. Danielle felt a surge of something cold and sharp, a dangerous mix of anger and determination. This wasn't just about poor sales figures anymore. This was about a systemic rot, a culture of prejudice that had taken root and flourished in this dealership. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of the bigger picture, the necessary charade. I assure you, she said, her voice now carrying a subtle edge, I'm quite capable of appreciating and affording the finer things in life. I like to see that executive model, please. Maddox's smile tightened, a strained grimace that barely concealed his annoyance. He hesitated for a moment, clearly calculating the potential commission against the perceived effort. He glanced over at another salesman, a younger man who had been observing the interaction with a curious expression. T-Max, Maddox called, his tone sharp. Why don't you take over here? I need to handle a call. He retreated quickly, his practiced charm dissolving into a hasty escape. T-Max approached, his demeanor mirroring Maddox's initial disinterest. Danielle's internal monologue was a relentless churn of anger and strategic calculation. This confirms it. It's a pattern. They've created an environment where discrimination is the norm. This visit wasn't just about observing. It was about dismantling. She met T-Max's gaze, a silent challenge in her eyes. The game was on. A flicker of movement caught her eye. A younger salesman, his name tag reading M. Caldwell, was watching the scene unfold, a complex expression on his face. He looked uncomfortable, almost apologetic. Danielle filed the observation away, a small spark of curiosity amidst the growing inferno of her anger. Perhaps there's still some hope here. The thought, small and tenuous, offered a sliver of light in the darkening landscape of the Augusta dealership. The Augusta showroom gleamed under the sterile fluorescent lights, a vast expanse of polished chrome and gleaming paint reflecting the city's nascent morning sun. Danielle Rivers, disguised in simple slacks and a nondescript blouse, sat nestled in one of the plush leather armchairs, a forgotten brochure clutched in her hand. Her outward demeanor was one of casual interest, but beneath the surface, a current of unease coiled tighter with every passing moment. The expensive coffee in the Fairlane-branded mug had long since grown cold, mirroring the chilling realization that was slowly hardening in her gut. She had been observing the dynamics of the showroom for the better part of an hour, a silent spectator to a play of subtle yet unmistakable discrimination. A well-dressed, white couple had entered mere minutes after her, their arrival immediately prompting a flurry of activity. Maddox, a senior salesman whose name tag flashed a disconcerting self-assurance, had practically pounced on them, his smile radiating an almost predatory eagerness. The couple, basking in the attention, had been whisked away for a test drive before Danielle had even finished browsing the first page of her brochure. Another couple, a Hispanic family speaking quietly amongst themselves, had fared differently. They had lingered near a sleek sedan, their eyes tracing its lines with evident interest. T-Max, another salesman with a slicked-back hairstyle and an air of disdain barely concealed, had glanced at them dismissively, then returned to his phone call, his voice booming with feigned enthusiasm about some weekend golf game. The family, after a few hesitant glances towards the occupied salespeople, eventually drifted towards the exit, their disappointment palpable in the slump of their shoulders. Danielle's internal monologue word. It wasn't just a slow morning. This was a deliberate choice, a practiced filtering of potential customers. The knot in her stomach tightened. She had hoped her initial observations were wrong, a misinterpretation of a busy morning rush. But the pattern was becoming undeniable, woven into the very fabric of the dealership's operations. The receptionist, a young woman with elaborately curled hair and a bored expression, contributed to the atmosphere of neglect. She seemed more interested in filing her nails than acknowledging the waiting customers, her gaze fixed on her task, as if the showroom were empty. Danielle watched a young black man approach the desk, a polite question forming on his lips. The receptionist barely glanced up, offering a vague gesture towards the scattered salesmen without a word. The man hesitated, then retreated, a flicker of frustration crossing his face before he turned and left. Danielle took a slow, deliberate sip of the cold coffee, the bitterness a fitting accompaniment to the scene unfolding before her. This wasn't incompetence. It was a calculated disregard. Her initial plan had been to observe discreetly, gather enough evidence to address the issues with Jeremy Buttrell, the sales manager. But a new, colder anger was beginning to simmer beneath her professional detachment. The final straw came in the form of a young white man, barely out of his teens, who sauntered into the showroom wearing basketball shorts and a faded t-shirt. His demeanor was casual, almost bordering on arrogant, yet he was greeted with the same enthusiastic welcome as the well-dressed couple from earlier. Maddox, his charm dialed up to 11, ushered him towards a top-of-the-line sports car, the same model the Hispanic family had been admiring just moments ago. Danielle watched, her jaw clenched, as Maddox launched into his sales pitch, his words dripping with an exaggerated sincerity that felt deeply insulting in its transparency. The casual disregard for other potential customers, the blatant prioritization based on superficial appearances, it was all culminating in this single, stark display of prejudice. There was no hiding behind first impressions, she thought, the words forming a hard knot in her throat. This wasn't about clothing. It was about who they thought mattered. The simmering anger finally boiled over, a wave of righteous indignation washing over her. The careful mask of the unassuming customer slipped, replaced by the steely gaze of a woman in a position of power, a woman who was about to dismantle the carefully constructed facade of this prejudiced operation. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath to compose herself, the cool air doing little to quell the fire that had been ignited. Enough was enough. The casual observation was over. It was time for action. The brochure in her hand crinkled as her grip tightened, the innocuous paper suddenly feeling like a weapon in the battle she was about to wage. The subtle shifts in her posture, the tightening of her lips, the glint of steel in her now focused eyes, these were the only outward signs of the storm brewing within. The game had changed, and Danielle Rivers was ready to play. The muted hum of the air conditioning battled the faint scent of new car leather, a sterile, almost antiseptic smell that Danielle found strangely unsettling. Sunlight, filtered through the expansive glass facade of Fairlane Prestige, glinted off the polished hoods of luxury sedans, each a silent testament to the wealth that flowed through this Augusta dealership. Danielle shifted her weight, the cheap canvas tote bag digging in her shoulder, a deliberate discomfort meant to keep her grounded, to remind her of the charade she was playing. Nearly an hour she'd spent wandering the showroom floor, a solitary figure in a sea of ignored potential. She'd watched the dance unfold, the subtle yet unmistakable choreography of preferential treatment. The well-dressed couple, ushered immediately to a plush seating area, coffee proffered before they'd even stated their intentions. The businessman, phone glued to his ear, barely acknowledging the eager salesman, practically tripping over himself to offer assistance. And then there was her, a woman in jeans and a faded t-shirt, a canvas bag slung across her shoulder, apparently invisible. A flicker of movement in her peripheral vision. A young salesman, name tag reading Mark Caldwell, approached with a hesitant smile. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, his voice a quiet counterpoint to the boisterous laughter echoing from a group clustered around a particularly gleaming sports car. "Is there anything I can help you with today?" Danielle studied him, a flicker of something hope, perhaps, rising in her chest. He seemed genuinely polite, his gaze direct, lacking the calculating appraisal she'd seen in the eyes of the other salesman. He's different, she thought, the realization a small, surprising balm against the rising tide of her anger. "I'm just looking," she replied, her voice carefully neutral, "trying to get a feel for the new models." "Certainly," Mark said, gesturing toward a sleek, silver sedan. "That's the Fairlane Aurora. Redesigned this year. Improved fuel efficiency, state-of-the-art safety features." He began to reel off the specifications, a practiced recitation, yet there was an earnestness in his delivery that held her attention. Danielle listened, nodding occasionally, asking a few perfunctory questions. Her mind, however, was racing. Why him? She wondered. Why is he the only one who bothered to approach me? The answer, she suspected, was as simple as it was ugly. Her appearance. The other salesmen, Maddox and T-Max, their names now firmly etched in her memory, had sized her up and dismissed her, assuming she wasn't a serious buyer. The canvas bag, the jeans, the absence of ostentatious jewelry, these were the markers of her supposed insignificance. A bitter taste rose in her throat. This wasn't just about lost sales, it was about a deeper rot, a systemic bias that infected the very core of this dealership. And she, Danielle Rivers, Regional VP of Fairlane Automotive, was here to excise it. Mark, oblivious to the storm brewing within her, continued his patient explanation. He opened the car door, inviting her to sit inside, to feel the leather, to experience the car firsthand. A flicker of genuine respect in his eyes, a stark contrast to the dismissive glances she'd received from the others. "Thank you, Mark," she said, her voice softening slightly. "I appreciate your help." He smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression. "My pleasure, ma'am. Just let me know if you have any other questions." He lingered for a moment, then, sensing her need for space, moved away, giving her time to absorb the information, to weigh her options. Or, in her case, to plan her next move. It was time to end this charade. She walked towards the sales manager's office, her steps measured, her gaze fixed on the nameplate on the door. Jeremy Buttrell, sales manager. She knocked once, sharply, then pushed the door open without waiting for a response. Jeremy, a man whose carefully coiffed hair and expensive suit seemed at odds with the chaotic energy of the showroom floor, looked up, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Yes?" he asked, his tone clipped. "I'd like to speak with you," Danielle said, stepping into the office. The air inside was thick with the cloying scent of cheap cologne and stale ambition. "Do I know you?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "Not yet," Danielle replied, her voice low and steady. "I'm Danielle Rivers." The name hung in the air, a sudden shift in the atmosphere, a palpable thickening of the tension. Jeremy's eyes widened, a flicker of recognition, then quickly, expertly masked by a veneer of professional courtesy. "Ms. Rivers," he said, rising from his chair. "Regional VP. To what do we owe the pleasure?" "I walked this floor for almost an hour," Danielle said, her voice rising, the controlled fury she'd held in check now beginning to surface. "I watched who got greeted and who didn't. I watched who got taken seriously and who got brushed off." She paused, letting her words sink in, watching the play of emotions across Jeremy's face: surprise, denial, a quickly suppressed flicker of fear. He opened his mouth to speak, but Danielle cut him off. "Don't insult me with excuses," she said, her voice now laced with steel. "I saw it with my own eyes. The blatant discrimination, the appalling customer service. And you," she pointed a finger at him, "you're responsible." The silence in the office was deafening, broken only by the muffled sounds of activity from the showroom floor. Jeremy's face had paled, the carefully constructed facade of confidence crumbling under the weight of her accusation. He opened his mouth again, this time managing to stammer out a few disjointed words. "Ms. Rivers, I assure you." Danielle raised a hand, silencing him. The game was over. The time for pleasantries had passed. It was time for action. The consequences, she knew, would be swift and decisive. And somewhere in the midst of the storm she was about to unleash, a quiet, competent young salesman named Mark Caldwell would find himself rising through the ranks. The fluorescent lights of the Fairlane Prestige showroom hummed, a sterile counterpoint to the hushed tension that filled the air. Danielle Rivers stood at the head of the polished mahogany conference table, its surface reflecting the grim lines of her face. Just minutes ago, this room had buzzed with the forced joviality of a sales team meeting. Now, a palpable silence pressed down, thick and suffocating. She could almost taste the fear, metallic and sharp on the back of her tongue. Her fingers, interlaced before her, felt cold despite the Georgia heat shimmering beyond the glass walls. This wasn't how she'd envisioned the morning unfolding. The sting of Maddox's dismissive sneer, the echo of T-Max's condescending laughter, they reverberated in her memory, fueling the quiet storm brewing within her. She'd spent years climbing the corporate ladder, navigating a world often hostile to women, and she hadn't gotten here by flinching. This wasn't about a single sale lost. It was about a cancer eating away at the heart of her company, a rot that started with casual prejudice and ended with customers walking out the door, their dignity diminished. Her gaze swept over the assembled faces. Maddox, his usual swagger replaced by a nervous shifting, avoided her eyes. T-Max, pale and sweating, stared fixedly at the table. Jeremy Buttrell, the sales manager, maintained a carefully neutral expression, his eyes flickering with a guarded calculation that Danielle recognized instantly. He knew. He had to have known. The pervasiveness of the problem screamed complicity. Only Mark, the young salesman who'd treated her with unexpected respect, met her gaze directly. A flicker of something, perhaps concern, perhaps a shared understanding passed between them. It was a small spark of decency in a room choked with the stench of prejudice. "I came here undercover," Danielle's voice, though quiet, sliced through the silence like a honed blade. Her internal monologue raged. Was this the right approach? Direct confrontation, swift and brutal. Perhaps a more subtle strategy would yield better long-term results. But the raw injustice of what she'd witnessed clawed at her, demanding immediate action. She pushed aside the fleeting doubt. This wasn't a game of chess. It was a fight for the soul of her company. I posed as a customer who, apparently, didn't fit the profile of someone who could afford a Fairlane. The words hung in the air, each syllable heavy with unspoken accusations. She watched as the blood drained from Maddox's face, leaving him ashen. Good. Let him feel the weight of his actions. Let him understand the consequences of judging a book by its cover. This isn't about one lost sale, gentlemen, Danielle continued, her voice gaining strength, each word fueled by the simmering anger she'd held in check for hours. This is about a culture that has festered within these walls, a culture where people feel empowered to treat customers based on how they dress, how they speak, or what shade their skin happens to be. The silence that followed was even heavier than before, punctuated only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. Danielle allowed it to stretch, letting the weight of her words sink in. This wasn't just a reprimand. It was a declaration of war against the ingrained biases that threatened to destroy everything she'd worked for. "Mr. Maddox," she said finally, her voice sharp and devoid of any warmth. "Your employment with Fairlane Automotive Group is terminated effective immediately. Maddox's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. What? You can't do this. I'm your top salesman. His voice cracked. The bravado he'd worn so effortlessly just hours ago crumbling into a desperate plea. Danielle met his gaze unflinchingly. Top salesman? You base your sales on prejudice, Mr. Maddox. You choose who deserves respect based on superficialities. That's not salesmanship. It's discrimination, and it has no place in my company. She turned her attention to Betrell, her gaze cold and assessing. Mr. Betrell, I expect a full report on your desk by the end of the week outlining the steps you will take to address this systemic problem. I will be back next month to assess the progress. Her words were a clear warning, a promise of further consequences if her expectations weren't met. She could see the flicker of resentment in his eyes, quickly masked by a veneer of professional compliance. He might resent her intervention, but he wouldn't dare challenge her authority. Not now. Not after she'd exposed the rot within his dealership. A wave of nausea threatened to overwhelm her. This was the ugly side of the business, the part that kept her awake at night. The power she wielded felt heavy, a burden of responsibility she couldn't afford to shirk. Then, her gaze fell on Mark, the young salesman who had treated her with genuine respect. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. There was still hope. There were still people who understood the true meaning of customer service, who valued integrity over prejudice. Mark, she said, her voice softening slightly, you treated me like a human being. You didn't make assumptions. You listened. She paused, letting the words resonate. Effective immediately, you are the new senior salesman. A look of stunned surprise, quickly followed by a flush of pride, spread across Mark's face. He nodded, his eyes bright with a mixture of gratitude and determination. In that moment, Danielle felt a flicker of something akin to hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, this single act, this small ripple of change, could be the beginning of a larger transformation. The fight was far from over, but she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was on the right side. The air in the room, though still thick with tension, now held a different quality. The oppressive silence had been broken, replaced by the faintest whisper of change. The battle had just begun. The stale, recirculated air of the Fairlane Prestige showroom hung heavy, a stark contrast to the crisp autumn air outside. Danielle Rivers stood by the expansive glass windows, watching the slow churn of traffic on Washington Road. The faint scent of new car leather, usually a comforting aroma, felt suffocating now. The events of the morning had left a bitter taste in her mouth, a residue of disappointment that clung to her like the showroom's artificial fragrance. Jeremy Betrell, the sales manager whose complacent attitude had fueled the festering rot within his team, had just agreed to a transfer. A lateral move, a shuffling of deck chairs on a sinking ship. It wasn't the outright dismissal she'd considered, but it was a start. A small victory in a war against ingrained prejudice. She'd offered him a choice of transfer to a smaller, less prestigious dealership in Macon or termination. The blood had drained from his face as she'd spoken, his carefully constructed facade of nonchalance crumbling like dry clay. He'd stammered, spluttered justifications, but the words had rung hollow, devoid of genuine remorse. In the end, he'd chosen the transfer, a quiet admission of guilt cloaked in forced acceptance.